deemed so dangerous that they couldn't even enter the country. His 2016 opponent, Hillary Clinton, was cast as a criminal. Protesters at his rallies treated harshly.
If you see somebody getting ready to throw a tomato, knock the crap out of them, would you? Seriously. Okay? Just knock the hell. I promise you, I will pay for the legal fees.
His most frequent target, though, has been the media.
A few days ago, I called the fake news the enemy of the people, and they are. They are the enemy of the people.
While raging at his enemies, Donald Trump also delivered his America First message of economic populism, and it spoke to a large swath of white and working-class America who lifted him all the way to the White House.
The forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no longer.
But less than a year into the job, a tragedy presented the president with a moment for healing. A neo-Nazi rally in Charlottesville, Virginia turned deadly when a white supremacist plowed his car into a crowd of counter-protesters, killing a young woman. In the moment, the president couldn't find the words to clearly condemn the hatred.
You also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
Since Charlottesville, even though right-wing extremists have been responsible for the vast majority of terrorist attacks and plots in the United States, the president almost exclusively condemns and inflates left-wing violence.
The violence and vandalism is being led by Antifa and other radical left-wing groups.
But a confluence of crises over the last year has perhaps tested the nation and its commander-in-chief more than any other in modern history. As the novel coronavirus spread rapidly across the United States, and has now killed nearly 400,000 Americans, President Trump has consistently underplayed the threat.
We have it totally under control. It's one person coming in from China, and we have it under control. It's going to be just fine.
He's sidelined key experts and berated state officials who've tried their own lockdowns to stop the virus's spread. In Michigan, for example, Mr. Trump supported armed anti-lockdown demonstrators who occupied the state capitol in April. 6 men were later charged with conspiring to kidnap Michigan's Democratic governor, Gretchen Whitmer. The president spoke at a rally in Lansing shortly after that plot was thwarted.
Hey, Governor, let your state open. Get your kids back to school, Governor. Not a good governor.
Amid the pandemic, another crisis. Nationwide protests broke out over the police killings of George Floyd in Minneapolis and Breonna Taylor in Louisville.
Hands up!
Protesters across the country took to the streets, decrying the disproportionate police violence experienced by Black Americans. While most demonstrations were peaceful, some did lead to violent clashes with law enforcement. Instead of an appeal for calm, the president inflamed tensions.
You just saw it outside. You saw these thugs that came along. These people call them protesters. Isn't it beautiful?
In a remarkable scene over the summer, military forces were called in to help clear protesters outside the White House so the president could pose outside a nearby church.
Stay violent.
And long before any votes were cast in last year's election, the president repeatedly, falsely claimed, just as he had in 2016, that the vote count would be rigged against him.
This election will be the most rigged election in history.
And he refused to denounce supporters who threatened violence, famously refusing to rebuke the hate group known as the Proud Boys.
What do you want to call them? Give me a name. Give me a
White
name.
supremacists and
white like me to condemn?
White supremacists and right
Proud Boys. Stand back and stand by.
And when it was clear that he did in fact lose, a moment when virtually every other losing presidential candidate has graciously conceded the race and wished the victor good luck, President Trump did the opposite.
I've already decisively won.
He continued to falsely claim that he'd been robbed of victory by fraud. When his dozens and dozens of legal appeals were thrown out of courts nationwide, the president went to enormous lengths to personally pressure state officials to overturn Biden's victory.
So what are we going to do here, folks? I only need 11,000 votes. Fellas, I need 11,000 votes.
At rallies, he continued to claim that Democrats had stolen the election and that an illegitimate president was trying to take the White House from him and from them. He asked his supporters to come to Washington last week.
We're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down to the Capitol.
That afternoon, an angry mob of Trump supporters and various extremist, white supremacist, and anti-government groups battered the police, broke into the Capitol, left 5 people dead, and cast a dark shadow over the end of the Trump presidency. Now, after ominous warnings from law enforcement, the nation's capital and state capitals all over the country are on edge. They're worried about who may show up next, armed and dangerous and full of false, poisoned ideas about a stolen country. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm William Brangham.
Even with President Trump's impending departure from public office, last week's riots and assaults have underscored how much work remains when it comes to dealing with long-standing concerns over extremist elements and how we deal with them. For years, there have been warnings and outright violence that foreshadowed bigger problems. Amna Nawaz examines what we know about the proliferation of extremists and the role of law enforcement.
Judy, we're also going to take a moment to examine the missed chances to address these problems and to meet the threat. I'm joined by 3 guests who've worked on this extensively. Kathleen Belew is a professor of U.S. history at the University of Chicago and has studied and written on the white power movement in America. Daryl Johnson is a former lead analyst for domestic terrorism at the Department of Homeland Security. He authored a 2009 report that warned of the threat of right-wing extremism. And Justin Hansford is a professor at Howard University School of Law and director of the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center. He was also on the ground in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014 after the police killing of Michael Brown. Welcome to you all, and thank you for joining me here. Daryl Johnson, I'm going to start with you because back on Election Day in 2020, which feels like a long time ago, a lot of people were expressing relief that they thought the worst was behind them. The election had unfolded relatively peacefully. You said on that day, quote, "It's the period after the election that's going to be more volatile and higher risk." Did you see the attack on the Capitol that we saw last week coming?
Well, it definitely was a type of scenario that I was concerned about. In fact, we had 2 previous breaches of state capitals in Michigan and Idaho that had preceded this insurrection at the U.S. Capitol last week. So it was on my mind as a potential scenario, and we're fortunate that it didn't get a lot worse.
Justin Hansford, a lot of people on the Capitol grounds that day were saying this was about the election. This was about politics. This was about protecting or claiming back, they told me, claiming back democracy. What did you see as you watched that siege on the Capitol unfold?
The image that stuck out to me, of course, is the image of the Confederate flag and the idea that white supremacy was ushered into the Capitol. And it was a sharp contrast to the way that we were received when Black Lives Matter protesters were protesting over the course of the summer and into the fall. So I think for many of us who were involved in those protest movements, we saw it as a continuation of the conversation on race and law enforcement that began really when Mike Brown was killed in 2014 and reached this past summer.
And I want to dig more into that law enforcement response in a moment. But Kathleen Belew, let's turn to you here, because among the people we met on the Capitol grounds that day, there were conspiracy theorists, people spouting QAnon theories, just really divorced from reality. We also saw members of extremist groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. We should say these groups predate President Trump, but they have now become some of his most strident backers and are willing to commit this kind of violence in his name. Why is that? What do we need to understand?
So I think the key here is that there are 3 main constituencies of people who came to the Capitol on January 6th. There are the diehard Trump supporters who are deeply invested in the president. There are QAnon conspiracy believers who have been quite quickly radicalized over the past months and years. And then there's this longer trajectory of activism that I would broadly think of as the white power movement and the militant right. But I think it would be a mistake to overly think that this is about President Trump. At the end of the day, I don't think we have enough evidence to think that the president has the power to command this groundswell or to call it off.
So, Justin, let me turn to you here, because you hear Kathleen talking about a history of violence among these groups. Daryl Johnson pointing to more recent examples of violence from these groups. And yet the police force we saw there to greet them was barely present. We were there. And also, it took a very long time for National Guard or any kind of supplementary force to arrive there. Now, some former senior officials have told me since there was a failure of imagination to think that it could unfold the way that it did. Why do you think that is?
There have been studies that have been conducted over the years that have shown that there is a phenomenon called protesting while black. Consistently, black protesters are seen as more threatening. And the way it plays out in the context of the First Amendment freedoms that are provided for protesters, it led me to write a law review article called The First Amendment Freedom of Assembly as a Racial Project. Because I think we have to understand that the law is what it does. The law is not necessarily what's on paper. It's how it plays out in real life. And for millions of protesters, 26 million people who took to the streets this past summer, people were harmed, people were tear gassed. There were tanks, there were military personnel out there. Their ability to make their voice heard through assembly was severely curtailed as opposed to what happened this past week. And that's what it is. This is a question of whether or not the First Amendment is being applied equally or whether or not it's a racial First Amendment. And I think the answer was very clear to millions of people around the country. And it's almost like my law review article came to life like Frankenstein. So it's the complete opposite as to what you would see if we had Black, brown, or Muslim protesters in front of the Capitol.
Daryl, I think this is the part that baffles a lot of people is why haven't we seen a more robust, coherent response from federal authorities? The data is there, the evidence is there, the numbers are there. We know this threat has been growing. You look back to 9/11, the entire government was reorganized to meet back then the extremist Islamist threat. Why haven't we seen that here?
Well, I think it's a combination of factors, poor planning, there's institutional bias. There was no, precedent attack that showed that these types of people, were aggressive towards law enforcement. Like I said, the institutional biases, the fact that they think that the, white protesters aren't going to be agitated to the point where they're going to, breach the police lines. And for some reason, they think that they might show more respect towards the police. So it was a combination of factors, and unfortunately, it was a tough lesson to learn, and we finally learned, the consequences of having these institutional biases.
But it's not as if the warnings haven't been there, right? I mean, we mentioned this 2009 report. You had written warning about the threat in 2012. You testified about the threat and said, here are specific things we need to do to meet it. How many of those steps have been put into place?
Very little to none. And so there's actually a lack of political willpower in Washington to recognize this threat and to come up with a strategy on how to combat it and deal with it.
Kathleen Belew, I need to run some quick headlines by you. Since the attack, we now know that one member of law enforcement has been arrested for his role in the attack. 2 Capitol Police have been suspended for posing with the mob and taking selfies. Off-duty cops have also been arrested. There's a retired Navy SEAL who posted videos bragging about breaching the Capitol. Are the same forces we'd be relying on to respond to this threat in some way sympathetic to it?
We have an unbroken record of white power violence that goes back to the early 1980s, if not earlier. We're talking about a groundswell that is decades, if not generations old, and has a history of the kinds of ideologies it follows and what targets we can expect based on those ideologies. We have a history of actions already undertaken. It's not enough to wake up after January 6th. We should have woken up after the Oklahoma City bombing. Same movement. And that was the largest mass casualty event in the United States between Pearl Harbor and 9/11. Now, the fact that most people walk around not understanding that that's part of the white power movement is an enormous problem for our public discourse. So when we think about failure of imagination, I just think that that's not anywhere near enough of an explanation, given that the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI have identified white extremism as the largest terrorist threat to Americans, outstripping not only what our president has called Antifa and the left, but also outstripping radical Islamist terror. We know that this is the problem. The resources have to be oriented around this particular thing. And the problem of infiltration of law enforcement and military by these groups has been the subject of a great deal of scholarly study, a great deal of journalistic expose. We know that this is the issue. So the question is, what will we as a society decide to do to mobilize our resources to address this problem?
So Daryl Johnson, let me put that question to you. As Kathleen has laid out decades of failures to address and respond to this threat, what would it take? Can it be done? Is this the time?
Yeah, I'm hoping that this is the time. You know, I've been calling for our political leaders to deal with this threat for the past 10 or 11 years. They've lacked the political willpower to do it. So now that their home base has been attacked and the Capitol ransacked and people vandalizing and stealing stuff and deaths that resulted. I hope that this is the wake-up call, the much-needed wake-up call that I've been calling for the past 10 years. So it's going to be incumbent on this new administration and dealing with both Republicans and Democrats coming together and denouncing this threat and developing strategies on how to better combat it.
Justin Hansford, what about you? Do you think this threat can and will be met by the incoming administration and